Flowey is Not a Good Life Coach by Unrested Jade. Chapter 23. Misfortune Comes in Threes. Green light arced from Undine's outflung hand. Sans had time to raise his left hand, but thankfully the green took effect before he could summon anything. "How did you get out?" Undine growled, striding forward. Or striding, anyway. She wasn't getting anywhere, feet pushing off empty air, ponytail drifting lazily upward. The crowd seethed uneasily as Undine bellowed her outrage. The temperature climbed several degrees. A sound like popping embers carried softly through the room. The shadows shifted, and Alphys caught movement from the corner of her eye. It was the bartender. He'd stepped out from behind the bar and now stood, arms crossed, watching the unfolding scene with calm authority. A bird-like woman on a nearby bar stool cleared her throat. Grilby says no fighting." As one, the crowd took a shuffling step back. "I'm not here to fight," Sans said, though he still held Undine just above the floor. His gaze darted around the room, waiting for someone to make a move toward him. No one did. "What then?" Undine snapped. Her legs kicked out, straining to gain purchase against the floor. The tips of her toes were a fraction of an inch above the floorboards, but she just couldn't reach. "And how the hell did you move that rock?" Sans ignored her, turning his attention to Alphys, who gave him a lame little wave. She didn't know what to expect. Why would Sans show up here? He'd managed to escape the shed, only to throw himself right back at every sentry and guard in Snowdon, in front of half the town. Not for the first time, things weren't adding up. "Al," he said, beckoning her with the slightest incline of his head, the most movement he was currently capable of. "Get my phone from my left pocket and hand it to Captain Undine. Please," he added, when she didn't move right away. Sliding out of the booth, Alphys approached, flinching under all the eyes that were now suddenly trained on her. Gingerly, she fished the cell phone out of Sans' pocket with two claws. She handed it over to Undine, having to reach up slightly higher than usual. "Listen to the last voice message," Sans said, as Undine fumbled with the buttons. Sans was apparently as bad about clearing out his inbox as he was about answering the phone in the first place. After a couple of minutes, Undine reached the last message. She listened to it, an irritated snarl on her lips. As she listened, her face softened from anger to a confused scowl. She replayed the message. After yet another listen, Undine thrust the phone into Alphys's hands. "I don't get it," she said, as Alphys held the phone to her ear. The reception had been bad, but Alphys could make out every word. Her frown deepened as the message played.
"I'm sorry. I can't fix this. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, and you must hate me now, and I guess you should. I need to go away for a while. Please don't do anything. Don't do anything stupid. You're safe where you are, so just wait, please. Sans, I'm so sorry. You didn't deserve this, and you didn't do anything wrong. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I love..."
Undine chewed her lip. What did he mean by all that? Alphys looked up to find Sans watching her, silently pleading. She lowered the phone as a lump of ice seemed to settle in her stomach. "It wasn't you." "What?" Undine straightened, not quite at a right angle with the floor below. "Who else could it be? You were there. Papyrus let me lock him up." Alphys looked from Undine to the phone screen. The timestamp for the voice message was hours old. "I know, but the message doesn't make sense otherwise." She chewed her lip. "He kept insisting it wasn't Sans." Undine scoffed, but a flicker of doubt crossed her face. "Paps has been lying for weeks. He was just trying to protect his brother. He was, Sans said, but not from you. He twitched slightly, trying to fight off the green. Look, shithead, as much as I really don't appreciate the accusation, I get what you're trying to do. You don't have to tell me where he is. Just tell me he's safe. Frowning, Undine opened her mouth, only to snap it shut again. We don't know where he is, Alpha said, stepping forward. No one's seen him since last night. The lights in Sans' eye sockets guttered for a moment. Fuck, he hissed. Undine echoed the curse under her breath. But I asked him! He wouldn't give me a name! Yeah, well... Sans trailed off, as though finishing the thought was a wasted effort. If they had the wrong person, then Papyrus was missing, and whoever was hurting him was still free. That wasn't an equation Alphys liked. We've looked all over town, she said. Sans shook his head. He won't be in town. Search the woods. If you're pulling shit, Undine said, jabbing a finger in Sans' direction, I will kick your ass all the way to New Home. She looked at the guardsmen standing at uneasy attention in the crowd. All right, we've got a lot of ground to cover, so look alive. A chorus of barking answered her. And you better stick where I can... Undine turned back in time to see the blue hem of Sans' jacket disappear around the door frame. That's strike one. Flowey held Papyrus down with a scorched vine. His body was too green to burn, but all that raw magic had done considerable damage regardless. Dismembered vines littered the clearing and his main stem was battered, leaving him unbalanced and wobbling. If Papyrus hadn't tired himself out so quickly, Flowey might have had a real problem on his hands, metaphorically speaking. You know, Flowey said, watching Papyrus claw at the vine, it never fails to astound me how little you value your own life. Blackened strips of vegetation peeled up like curling ribbon under the fingertips of Papyrus's gauntlets. Flowey let him go, loosening and lifting the vine. Not that he could really feel pain, but it was easier to heal without fresh damage taking place. Besides, with the way Papyrus was shaking, it was doubtful that the skeleton could stand, much less do anything else. As impressive as that burst of desperate magic had been, now it was done. Flowey watched the animal terror drain from Papyrus's face, replaced by confusion. With quivering limbs, Papyrus pushed himself up onto his knees. That was as far as he could go, arms bracing him in the slushy mud. It took a visible effort for Papyrus to lift his hand to meet Flowey's gaze. His breath rattled without lungs or throat. Just get it over with. Dim as they were, Papyrus's eye sockets held the tiniest glint of light. He returned Flowey's stare, spent and shaking but defiant. It wasn't the obedient attitude that Flowey required right now, but it was pretty cool on its own merits. Flowey smiled fondly. Brave, silly idiot. Now, Papyrus, Flowey said, angling his face lower. No one likes a quitter. Didn't you want to kill me a moment ago? Slowly, the facade cracked. Papyrus's head sagged low, and Flowey could see his shoulders hitching. A thinner, less damaged vine curled under Papyrus's chin, lifting his face again. That's why you couldn't, Flowey cooed, dabbing at Papyrus's tears. I'm a poor choice for a first kill, friend. You have too long to think about what you're doing. I'm not... Shh, Flowey soothed. I know. This is a big step for you. He stroked his remaining petals, making a show of thinking hard. Maybe I'm not giving you enough incentive to push through this little hang-up of yours. But first, he said, we need to address what you just did. What did you just do, Papyrus? Fists balling up against the thawed ground, Papyrus glared. The lingering sniffles undercut the effect somewhat. Main stem heaving in the equivalent of a shrug, Flowey rolled with the now rhetorical question. You know I'm not mad at you about attacking me, so what does that leave? You refused me. He grinned. You know I don't like that. And today isn't the day to disappoint me. Wordlessly, Papyrus held out his right arm. So tough! Winding a vine around the offered arm, Flowey giggled. Good job, friend. You're not bawling or anything. Good. Papyrus shifted on his knees, bracing himself. He thought he knew what was coming. Flowey grinned. Good, Papyrus, he said, flexing the vine. This correction was going to stick. He'd make sure of that. Papyrus wasn't listening. Breathe in and hold. Out and hold. Again. It would hurt, but he could manage. He'd done it before. It would hurt, but he was alive, and so was she. It was worth it. He blinked as he felt air against his right hand. Flowey tossed aside his gauntlet, winking at him. A vine roughened with magic burns wound in and out through his hand and curled around his thumb, stroking gently. Papyrus flexed his fingers, and in turn the bones of his hand shifted uncomfortably against the intruding vine. Will your magic hold everything together, or are we going to have to hunt for lost knuckles in the snow? Shaking his head, Papyrus looked away. He didn't know what would happen, and the possibility that his hand might simply fall apart was too awful to contemplate. With a sigh, he stared unseeing at the dirty snow beneath him. That now familiar feeling of disconnection pushed him slightly out of himself, and he welcomed it with open arms. Papyrus didn't cry out when the bones of his hand cracked under a hard and sudden squeeze. Dizzy, he sucked in a gasp of air, shock and detachment dulling the pain to a throbbing ache. He fought the urge to look, instead staring resolutely down, finding nonsensical patterns in the snow. It hurt, but the worst was already over. With a deep breath, Papyrus relaxed, careful to keep his broken hand absolutely still. Wow, Papyrus, Flowey said, bracing the bones as he healed them. That was pretty badass. Not a peep. There, it was done. Papyrus leaned his weight onto his knees, lifting his free hand to scrub at his face. Relief rose and then quickly ebbed away as he realized that Flowey wasn't letting go. Huh. It's almost like this stuff doesn't even bother you anymore. Flowey's voice held a note of curiosity that signaled danger. Is that true? Looking up to find Flowey studying him like he was a cleverly designed puzzle, Papyrus tugged painfully against the vine still tangled up in his hand. No, he croaked. No. Flowey grinned, openly taunting. Were you answering my question? He asked, twisting the vine to grind the captured bones together. Or are you telling me no again? A wave of pain and nausea rose up to choke Papyrus's reply in his throat. The anticipation was so much worse now that he knew exactly what would follow. He swayed, bracing himself with his arm once more as his strength left him. He shook his head, dumb and frantic.
No.
You're not communicating very clearly, friend. Fingers curling in spasms as the bones of his palm contorted in ways they weren't meant to, Papyrus clawed at the air with his captured hand. He longed for the numbing fog to return. Flowey wasn't supposed to punish him twice. No sound came out when he tried to speak. Not that anything he said would make a difference now. He hung in limbo, tense and helpless while he waited for the inevitable. I hate this as much as you do, Papyrus, Flowey said, twist pulling until the outermost bone gave a wet snap. Papyrus shrieked. In a burst of feral energy, he threw himself back, heels digging ruts into the snow and dirt as he fought to get away. White-hot pain lanced up his arm when the next bone snapped, and he half prayed that his wrist would pop loose altogether. At least he'd be free.
Stop,
he begged.
Stop, please.
His magic flared out, weak and formless. He poured everything he had into the fight. Now he had nothing in reserve, no way to defend himself. The attempt alone left him light-headed and trembling. Flowey shook his head with a regretful sigh. I'm not stopping until you learn your lesson. You really let me down this time, Papyrus. You remember what happens if you fail your test, don't you? Or is Alphys not worth the trouble anymore? Grasping Papyrus's jaw, Flowey forced him to watch while that slender vine rolled along his shattered hand, prying the breaks apart. Seeing was infinitely worse than merely feeling, but Papyrus couldn't tear his gaze away. The fingers connected to the bones that were already broken twitched against his will, making his hand bend in a sickeningly wrong way. The third bone flexed slightly under the pressure, and he stared in sick fascination as a thin crack snaked its way along the bone's axis. Noise filled his head without comprehension. Was it him? Was he speaking, pleading, screaming? He couldn't tell. He could only watch the crack spread, feel as Flowey slowly bent the bone past its limit. The sound of breaking bone was lost in the roaring static filling Papyrus's awareness. In the moment before the pain caught up to the shock, he simply stared at the splintering ruin of his hand. Inside, the bones were delicately honeycombed with little open spaces. Who would have guessed that they would look like that? Like lace all bundled up in... The world tipped, and Papyrus was flat on his back before he registered that he was dropping. All tension left his body, and he was left blinking up at the distant ceiling and its sparse stars while everything spun and twirled around him. Stars moving in a circle, just like the real thing. Bones all full of lace, all fluffy and light. He was so light he could float right up off the ground and touch the stars as they passed by. Papyrus groaned, caught between trying to move because he wasn't safe and lying there in almost happy delirium. A double image of Flowey leaned into his line of sight, smiling twin gentle smiles down at him. Hanging in there, champ? Unaware that Flowey had healed his hand again, the fresh break cut through the mental haze like a dull knife. Papyrus let out a rasping sob. When would it stop? Flowey clicked his tongue, scolding, healing the bones a third time. You'll thank me for this later, Papyrus, he said, bending Papyrus's pinky back as far as it would go. Your friends would thank me too, you know. He pressed, and the resulting crack was drowned out by Papyrus's high screech.
No more, please,
Papyrus sobbed, all defiance flushed out by relentless pain.
Please, please, please.
Begging wouldn't help. Papyrus knew this, but he couldn't stop himself. Flowey's answer was to break his hand a fourth time. Papyrus convulsed as the vine squeezed and twisted the broken bones, wrenching them all out of alignment. His back arched off the ground, mouth gaping in a hoarse scream. There were no words, there was no thought. The whole world, all existence, was camera flash white and blinding pain. The pressure on his hand eased. The vine pulled away, hurting him all over again in the process, and let his arm drop to the ground. He writhed, choking on dry heaves. Fingers, broken and unbroken, twitched involuntarily. Papyrus could feel the motions bending his palm into the wrong shapes, joints that weren't joints at all. He didn't look at it. He knew what he would see. Flowey was saying something. He may have been asking a question, but Papyrus couldn't answer, couldn't even parse the sounds as speech.
You want to pass your test, don't you?
Flowey was a blur of color and movement above him.
It would be so happy if you did, friend.
Gritting his teeth, Papyrus flung his uninjured arm over his eye sockets. Too much. Everything was too much. In the dark, more of the sounds Flowey was making resolved themselves into words.
I hate to do this to you, Papyrus, really. You gave me no choice.
The tip of a vine brushed against Papyrus's face, wiping away a tear.
You'll hate yourself if you fail. Trust me,
Flowey said softly.
I don't intend to let you fail. I'm your friend. I care about you.
It was brutally clear that he was not a friend. Papyrus tried to say so, with no idea whether he'd formed the words correctly. He must have been close, because Flowey tutted at him. A vine lifted his arm off his face, and Papyrus struggled to focus on the yellow shape above him.
I'm your best friend, you silly goose,
Flowey said, and though his face remained calm and smiling, his voice was flat. Gently, Flowey pushed and pulled the broken bones into their proper places, while Papyrus whimpered in renewed misery. Several minutes of silence followed, Flowey seeming to pick up on his need to recover at last. Papyrus stared up at the ceiling as it slowed and came to a stop. He focused on his breathing. He did everything in his power to forget that Flowey existed. He found himself fervently wishing on every star in sight that he himself did not exist. But the snowdrake had escaped. He'd saved her. Breathe in, breathe out. It was worth it. Hey! Undine hit the floorboards, staggering. She kept her footing, but the half-second delay gave Sans a larger head start. Damn it, wait! She lurched forward, breaking the spell that had fallen over the crowd as monsters filled in behind her. Alphys was swept along with them, jostled and shoved out into the road. She clutched Sans' phone tighter to her chest to keep from dropping it. Sans was nowhere to be seen. Out at the front of the group, Undine coasted to a halt in the middle of the road, turning this way and that trying to find a clue as to which way he'd gone. How? Undine growled, ponytail whipping around her head as she scanned west, north, south, east, up. What the fuck? The tracker couple milled around a point in the trampled, packed-down snow. The trail ends here, sir, the dog-woman said, nostrils flaring, trying to catch even the slightest mote that would lead them in the right direction. How was that possible? Commotion from the west pulled Alphys from her wondering, every monster present shifting and straining to see who was approaching. A young snowdrake barreled down the road, shedding feathers and trailing ice. His favorite lay sprawled out in the snow, staring up at the ceiling. Aside from the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest and the occasional slow blink, Papyrus could pass for dead. His face was utterly devoid of expression, and though the lights in his eye sockets were bright, they were unfocused and glazed over. Nobody home. Flowey supposed he may have let his irritation run away with him, just a tad. But Papyrus had been so close. After all these runs, after getting his hopes up about finally seeing Papyrus actually kill something, watching him seemingly change his mind at the last second was an unbearable tease. That was why Flowey had taken some measure of satisfaction in hammering the point home, over and over, that he expected Papyrus to behave and follow directions. He'd been tempted to keep going for as long as his favorite remained conscious, but he wanted Papyrus functional. The line between obedient and catatonic was thin. "Now," Flowey said, "what do I need to do to motivate you, He doodled flowers in the slush. "A carrot won't work, so how about a bigger stick?" "I don't care," Papyrus rasped. He kept his gaze fixed upward. "Do your worst. I don't care." Catching himself with his vines outstretched, Flowey silently counted backward from 20. No need to rise to the bait. A little false bravado didn't mean the correction hadn't worked. Giggling, Flowey leaned over Papyrus. "Trust me, friend, you don't want my worst." His smile drooped. "But I can offer a better incentive, since you're so quick to throw yourself on the grenade, so to speak." Papyrus stared up at him, face a blank mask. "Maybe I won't kill you. You won't be the noble martyr this time." Flowey watched some of the life rekindle in his favorite's eye sockets. "Here's a riddle for you, Papyrus," he said, playing with the length of a dead vine. "What is the objective worth of a stranger's life? Is it equal to one other stranger's life? Or 2? Or 3? Is it worth the lives of a town?" The gears were starting to turn now. Papyrus pushed himself up on his elbows, tension rolling off him in palpable waves. "If you're truly honest with yourself, is a stranger's life worth as much as the life of a friend? Are all your friends' lives equally valuable? What's the balance point?" Flowey suppressed a grin. "I can find you some scratch paper if you need it." "What are you getting at?" Papyrus asked, in the tone of someone who didn't want an answer. Flowey couldn't help grinning then. "Do you think everyone is equally important? That every life is sacred? I know you believe that," he said, grin sliding into a leer. "But none of us is a saint, Papyrus, not even you. Be honest. You were willing to sacrifice Dr. Alphys if it meant you kept your hands clean." Papyrus sat up. "No!" "Yes!" Flowey chirped, looping a vine over Papyrus's shoulders. "That's exactly what you were doing. You didn't spare her a thought. Poor, pitiful Alphys." "No," Papyrus repeated, with less conviction. "I just—" By and large, Flowey had grown tired of tormenting Papyrus ages ago, but he had to admit that poking at the skeleton's simplistic morality still had some mileage left. "It's okay, friend. It's only natural. Some people are worth more than others. Clearly, Alphys isn't worth staining your nice white hands for," he said, curling a vine around Papyrus's bare, freshly healed hand. In a flash, Papyrus was upright, stumbling as he tried to pull his hand free. Flowey caught him before he could fall.
Careful, Papyrus, you'll hurt yourself.
Tracing the mended breaks that laced Papyrus's palm, Flowey hummed to himself for a moment.
Can you think of anyone who would be worthy? Anyone at all? Surely there's someone.
There wasn't any need to name names. Flowey knew of only one person who stood a chance of getting Papyrus to abandon his silly principles and take this final step. How ironic. The person who was, perhaps, the least deserving. Papyrus's magic stirred, prickling over Flowey's vines at every point of contact. It would be a while yet before his favorite could summon even a rudimentary attack, but the spirit was willing. Papyrus froze stock still in his grip.
Because you're my favorite, you get 2 more chances,
Flowey said, smiling.
And believe me when I say you don't want to waste my generosity. Think about the bigger picture, Papyrus. Your loved ones are depending on you to protect them.
They stood in silence while reality settled in. Papyrus wept quietly, frustrated. Flowey let him. Better he process this ahead of time, without the distraction of whatever monster they would run into next. If he came to terms with the situation now, it would mean less hesitation later. Flowey was sure they were close to achieving something huge. He wanted to see. "Walk," Flowey said, once he'd judged Papyrus's tantrum was over. He coaxed the skeleton into motion, vines pushing and pulling.
The sooner we find something else, the sooner you can finish your test. Won't that be a relief?
Papyrus said nothing, stumbling along beside him as they returned to the shade of the trees. Stuck in place as though he were the one with roots, Papyrus stared hard at the mold small in front of him, willing it to flee. It glurped agreeably at him.
"What are you waiting for, Papyrus?"
Flowey sighed.
"The longer you stand here, the harder it's going to be. Just do it."
Papyrus adjusted his grip on his bone club, palms burning like his own magic had turned hostile to the touch. He couldn't make his feet move. "I can't," he whispered. "I can't."
"Oh, for God's sake, Papyrus!"
Flowey snapped, rustling his leaves.
"It's just a mold small. They're barely self-aware."
He gestured at the gently jiggling monster.
"Look, it doesn't even understand what we're saying."
"It's still alive." This wasn't right. It didn't matter if mold smalls couldn't talk, or if they were a little strange. They were still monsters. It was still murder. Flowey rolled his eyes.
"Mushrooms are alive, friend. If I told you picking a mushroom would save your friends, you'd do it."
He submerged, popping up again a few feet away on the mold small's opposite side.
"Come on. No one's going to miss one stupid mold small."
Papyrus took a deep breath, trying and failing to quell the tremors running through his arms. Someone will. Papyrus nearly always saw mold smalls in groups. They must enjoy the company. Someone would miss this one, would wonder where it had gone. The mold small slid closer and wiggled in what seemed to be a friendly way. A few spores puffed out its top. Flowey frowned.
"I can't understand why you're being so difficult about this. I really don't,"
he said, glaring as Papyrus took a step back.
"You do know that if you don't kill this overgrown mold, you have to kill whatever we find next, right? Do you want to risk it being another one of the teenagers? Or do you want to fail?
No, Papyrus said, shuffling backward as the mold small failed to take the hint. It rubbed up against his leg, leaving a film of slime on his armor.
Well, Flowey said, you're going to fail at this rate. Get a grip, Papyrus. This thing isn't worth any more than Alphys or Undine. He sneered. Surely not your brother.
Vision blurred with tears, Papyrus took another step back, only to find he'd backed himself against a tree.
Go away, he hissed down at the mold small. I'm here to hurt you. Don't you understand? It doesn't. Even for a mold small, this one's stupid.
Flowey came closer, lifting a vine to wind around Papyrus's hands, lashing them to the club.
I can't do this for you, Papyrus, he said,
stretching up to eye level.
It won't even know what hit it. Just swing.
The vine let go, but Flowey remained hovering at Papyrus's shoulder, glaring at him expectantly. He couldn't. He just couldn't do it. He wouldn't. Flowey sighed, a sharp little huff.
Don't you care about sands at all? That shed has a dirt floor.
Papyrus clenched his teeth, squeezed the club tighter. He couldn't make himself move. This was all wrong. There had to be something else he could do. There had to be another way.
Stop crying over a pile of slime and think of your own family,
Flowey said, leaning close enough that Papyrus could feel the tickle of petals against the side of his face.
You're killing him, Papyrus. If you just stand here and do nothing, you're killing him.
God help him. Blinking back tears, Papyrus took a deep breath. He didn't want to do this. But Sans. 1 second. It would take just 1 second. It wouldn't feel a thing. With a desperate yell, Papyrus swung. The club dissipated, drifting onto the mold small in a harmless shower of spent magic. Papyrus's knees hit the ground, and he buried his face in his hands, howling. How could he have even thought? Breath against his skull made him cringe.
You selfish, self-righteous coward,
Flowey said. I can't! Papyrus fought down nausea, swallowing a lump that might have been his own soul trying to abandon him. He couldn't blame it. I can't! Please, I tried! And he had. Oh, God. Papyrus could feel the soft mass of the mold small's body leaning against him. It gurgled quietly, like it was trying to comfort him. It knew he was upset, but not why. Go away! Papyrus snarled, jabbing the mold small with his elbow. It quivered but didn't retreat. The gurgling started up again.
What would your friends say if they could see this? What would Sans say?
I can't, Papyrus repeated, mind racing, trying to find some way out of this and coming up empty. Please, we don't have to do any of this. We can stop. Flowey giggled.
What makes you think I want to stop?
Lowering his hands, Papyrus looked Flowey in the eyes, searching for something, anything, some scrap of the person he used to be. Please, he said, if you ever were my friend, can't we just go back to the way we were? I'll forgive you. I promise. He was grasping at straws. He didn't know what else to do. His magic hadn't recovered enough to help the mold small the way he'd helped the snowdrake girl. To his surprise, it was Flowey who looked away first, petals drooping to hide his face. "I don't want to do this," Papyrus said quietly. "Let's stop. Please, Azriel. Please." Flowey cringed, and for a wild, hopeful instant Papyrus thought he might have gotten through. But Flowey shook himself free of whatever glimmer of compassion had seized him soon enough. He tossed his petals back, smirking. "You're trying to manipulate me." Papyrus shook his head, denials bunching up in his throat. "No, You're not smart enough for that, Papyrus," Flowey said, showing teeth. "What, you thought the name I died with would snap me out of it? Remind me of what a good person I was?" "Azriel," Papyrus whispered, all other words momentarily obliterated from his mind. He'd made a fatal misstep. "Azriel!" Flowey crooned, twisting a vine around Papyrus's neck. "For all his strength was a weak, pathetic loser. And in the end, maybe that's all you are, too." He smiled, mild and calm. "It's okay, Papyrus. You're still my favorite. I can't stay mad at you." Papyrus knelt transfixed, like a mouse just before the snake's coils tighten. Despite Flowey's assurance, he couldn't shake the suspicion that the rest of his life wouldn't be measured in years, but rather hours, minutes, and seconds. Sooner or later, Flowey's patience would run out. "I'll be straight with you, friend. I couldn't care less about the Royal Guard anymore, or humans, or the barrier, or any of that window dressing. You ruined everything yesterday." Flowey shrugged. "Up until now, you were pleasing me so well. You can give me this one last thing, Papyrus. Think of it as my consolation prize. It's not killing a human, but it is killing something anyway." Papyrus scratched at the vine around his neck, unaware he was doing it and unable to stop himself once he did notice. "But why?" His voice shook. "There's no reason to—" "Reason?" Flowey tilted his head to the side, as though truly puzzled. "Reason? The reason, Papyrus, is that I want to see you kill. It would give me pleasure to watch you get your hands dirty for once. It would amuse me." "That's it?" Papyrus couldn't believe what he was hearing. Months of hell, culminating in this, and for what? Nothing? This is all just to entertain you? That wasn't possible. Everything he'd been through, for something as petty as that? He was going to die for something so meaningless? Giggling, Flowey tapped the tip of a vine against Papyrus's nasal bone. "Don't look at me that way, friend. You have no higher purpose, and you serve it so well. So," he said, gesturing to the mold small, which was now observing them from a few paces away, "give me what I want." If the thought of killing another monster for the sake of better protecting others was unacceptable, doing it to satisfy the whim of this cruel brat was obscene, sickening. Papyrus took a deep breath. He had to stay strong. He still had time to solve this. He couldn't give in now. "No!" Offering both arms, he braced himself. Once he started screaming, the mold small would run away. Humming thoughtfully, Flowey twined his vines around Papyrus's arms.
You'd rather be punished again? Are you sure?
Yes, Papyrus said, glaring. How could he choose any different?
Well, okie dokie.
Flowey swayed, his smile stretching a little too wide.
Remember, this is what you wanted.
Bullets coalesced in the air, and Papyrus's magic reacted, raising a few thin bones to shield him. But he wasn't the target. The mold small shuddered as the spray of bullets hit, then went rigid. Papyrus looked on as it gave a final wheezing belch and crumbled into dust. He couldn't look away.
Oh, would you look at that?
Flowey's voice dripped with fake sympathy.
The stupid slime heap is dead, and instead of being done,
he said, face splitting open to show the full length of his teeth,
you're on strike 2. There's no third option, Papyrus. Either you kill the next thing you go up against, or I kill everyone you love.
Papyrus called out for a blaster he was still too tired to summon. He felt himself dragged to his feet, vision tunneling until all he could see was Flowey's mocking smile. He staggered, dazed, pulled along like a toy on a string. That smile was moving, but once again it was too much to make out the words. Pushed back down onto his knees, Papyrus felt his bare right hand sink into something warm and dry. He blinked, struggling to differentiate between white snow, white bone, white powder.
And since this is so important to you...
Words filtered through, processed in a slow, unsteady drip. Papyrus lifted his hand, watching the fine grains sift through his palm.
It really makes me wonder what they would have liked the most, do you think?
A light breeze funneled down through the forest canopy, stirring up the dust. Papyrus was kneeling downwind. Fine powder clung to his eye sockets and teeth, and the lingering texture of his old burns. There was just enough time for Papyrus to turn his head away as he was sick, doubled over and retching.
Wow, Papyrus,
Flowey said, rubbing Papyrus's back where the straps securing his breastplate crossed over.
That's not how you act when you're officiating a funeral. Who raised you?
Arm clamped over a stomach he didn't have, Papyrus stared down at the scant few drops of phosphorescent blue melting pockmarks in the snow. He had little magic to spare, which made the hard clench that much more intense as his body tried to purge itself of whatever it could. Another wave of nausea swept over him, bringing up nothing more, leaving him whimpering and shivering.
Remember how this feels.
Flowey reached out and wiped a clinging strand of blue sick from Papyrus's mouth.
Think how much worse it would feel if that dust were someone you actually cared about.
Papyrus didn't want to think about it. Didn't want to think about what he'd have to do to avoid finding out firsthand. Possibilities split off, converged again, and dead-ended in his mind. There had to be a way out. There had to be. But he couldn't find it. One chance left before the trap was sprung, and he couldn't find the solution. He wouldn't see tomorrow. He was certain of that now. The realization didn't terrify him like he always thought it would. The only fear left to him was how to keep Flowey from following through on his promise. If he could buy enough time, if he could regain enough strength. Shaking, Papyrus pushed himself to his feet. Flowey made an approving sound.
Ready to go? Third time's the charm, Papyrus, he said,
following along in Papyrus's wake.
I believe in you.
Papyrus ignored him, gaze set on a point in the distance as he walked. His magic simmered beneath the surface. He forced it down. Not yet. He couldn't afford to waste energy. When the moment arrived, he had to be ready. He had to be able. This had to end. The forest was beautiful. The way the snow glittered in the dim light, the trees reaching up toward the false stars, the waxy green of the pine needles, their scent. Papyrus had lived in Snowdon for so long that he took it for granted. He'd spent countless hours in these woods, building and maintaining puzzles and traps of all kinds. That was a lifetime ago, it seemed, and now every detail around him caught his attention, oddly comforting. It felt like saying goodbye to an old friend. Only this forest would know what had really happened. No one would find him, just as Sans had feared. Papyrus was afraid, but he'd made up his mind. As much as he wished it hadn't come to this, Flowey was right. He'd been selfish, putting his ideals above the lives of those he loved. He would keep them safe. It would be worth it. His magic wasn't fully recovered yet, but perhaps another hour would be enough. He didn't want to wait too long, lest they drag yet another monster into this. But he didn't want to rush either. Every minute he waited returned some of his strength, improved his odds. If he couldn't win, he'd at least make sure Flowey couldn't win either. Flowey followed him at a distance, perhaps confident that Papyrus wouldn't try to escape. That was fine. Papyrus had witnessed the result of trying to reach out. There was nothing more to say. They'd each made their choice. Even now, Papyrus couldn't help but feel sorrow for the creature he'd once considered his friend. There was little that he couldn't forgive, but if Azrael wasn't willing to try, if he was really that far gone, Papyrus wouldn't let anyone else suffer for the sake of Azrael's hurt. He'd do what he had to, for Undine and Alphys, for all his friends, for Sans. Bro? Freezing in place, Papyrus replayed the word in his head. He was so out of it he was starting to hallucinate. There was no way his brother could be out here in the woods. He was back at home, trapped but relatively safe. Papyrus turned, expecting to find only his own tracks in the snow, or Flowey having a laugh at his expense. No. Sans rushed forward, colliding with him in a forceful hug.
"Oh, thank God,"
he said, voice quavering.
"I thought I'd never. I've been looking all over for you."
Sans, what? Papyrus stood dumbfounded, not returning the hug.
How did you get here? How did you find me? You can't be here!
Shaking himself free of Sans' hold, he pushed his brother away. Sans blinked tears from his eye sockets, reaching for him even as Papyrus backed up.
"Papyrus, it's okay," he said. "Everyone's got to be out searching for you by now. We'll meet up with Undine or the dogs. It's gonna be okay. I promise."
How was this happening?
"No, you don't understand. You can't be here."
Papyrus scanned the trees around him. Where was Flowey?
"Please," he begged, "just leave before—"
"Howdy!"
Slowly, like every joint was encased in ice, Papyrus looked down. Next to his boot, near enough to stomp on, Flowey grinned up at his brother.
"Boy, you have really crappy timing."